When you care about current affairs, it's on the OShow.
Welcome to the OShow, Canada's Current Affairs Show. I'm your host, Laura Babcock, and joining me on the program for the very first time is none other than David Moscrop. Now, I have never met this man, but I certainly have read his hot takes, mostly on X, and have enjoyed his political views. As I delved a little further into what David's all about, I learned that he's written for the Washington Post. He's also written for Maclean's. He wrote a book, Too Dumb for Democracy, which I love on levels, the concept of educating people on why we make decisions against our own interest. And as far as I understand it, David's also got a book coming up on the idea of Canadian nationalism. And after the throne speech that we witnessed this week, I have a feeling with all of Carney's initiatives and promises that we're going to have a hell of a Canada Day to celebrate if everything goes to plan. So I want to talk to David about a number of things today, about the throne speech, of course, about some of the comments from the US ambassador since the throne speech, and Trump, of course, bringing up annexation again. And then we can get into nationalism, get into Alberta separation, whatever David and I feel like talking about. David Moscrop, welcome to the O Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, this is a show for strong opinions, and I know that you have them. Just one of the funny ones that I loved yesterday after the whole shoe brouhaha around. Justin Trudeau wore those shoes, which I thought I grew up in Montreal. I found them quite fashionable. I love it. But to see some media people jump right on it, it was even in the UK Telegraph about the stupid shoes. And you made a comment I loved, which is like, I can't believe Canadian media are talking about this, but so am I, because I'm weak-willed or something. Said.
Weak-willed and stupid.
Yeah, it's totally stupid. So we don't need to get into Trudeau's shoes, but I do want to get your thoughts on the throne speech. You and I think, agree it was for an audience of one in the US. It was written for Donald Trump. What were your high-level and low-level takeaways on the speech, David?
Well, I mean, the Trump point is critical, is we knew this was coming, that the whole point of having the king here was to send a message in some sense to Canadians, but to Donald Trump first and foremost. This is why you bring the king over. Of course, that's risky because then people start saying, wait a second, he doesn't live here. He doesn't go here. He's from somewhere else. He's from a different country. And then we have to get into all of us pedants saying, well, technically he's the king of Canada in this context, not the king of the United Kingdom. And it becomes a whole thing. But the point was to send a message to Donald Trump. And obviously that message got through, which is why we had Donald Trump all of a sudden talking about the 51st state again after the ambassador, Pete Hoekstra, said that he was done talking about that. So that's one point. The other point was the speech was at once a fairly conservative speech in the sense that it reflects a kind of conservative way of governing, a smaller government, a leaner government, a government that, as Mark Carney likes to say, spends less and invests more, but also extraordinarily ambitious and perhaps, let's say, overly optimistic, perhaps, in the sense that, Mark Carney's talking about growing Canadian influence around the world, entering all these new partnerships, breaking down trade barriers, fast-tracking projects, and getting it all done very, very quickly. And one of the other things I had noted was this government, for all its enthusiasm and energy and desire to get a lot of things done really quickly, ambitious things, risks getting mugged by reality when you run into the fact that as great as it is to say things like, we're going to reduce the time it takes to approve an infrastructure project from 5 years to 2 years. Well, that sounds pretty good. When you start to do that, you realize, oh my Lord, there's all this stuff we have to do and all these people we have to talk to. And now we're getting sued in the courts. And then you realize that reality is sometimes different than theory. So quite an ambitious speech in some ways, a conservative speech in other ways, and one that's going to challenge, perhaps even change, but certainly challenge reality.
Well, it's a good summary. And, a couple of things tickled me about the speech. One of them was that it was written to Trump. And when I checked how the world received it, that very line, Canada is indeed true north, strong and free. Maybe Charles added the indeed for emphasis, but that was picked up right away at 4 o'clock on CNN. That was in their headline roll. And then I heard it on German news the next morning, those exact words. And, as someone who writes speeches and, getting that main idea through to break through the noise, to break through all of the nonsense that competes with it in this Trump era, I thought was successful for Carney and for the king. That was the message that needed to get to Trump. But also, I thought the message to the Canadian domestic audience was the emphasis on confidence. Canada is a confident country. Not only did the king say that, but we saw Carney say that multiple times as a pivot to strength when he did his post throne speech interview on CBC. And as someone who works a lot with leadership, with communications, being able to actually tell people how to think about themselves is very powerful, because then when you take that framework of confidence, then it's easier to accept some of these very ambitious programs that were listed in the speech, because it makes Canadians feel like, could we really do this? I mean, when the king said that by the way, I don't know if you speak French, David, but I kind of enjoyed this pace of the king's French because my French has gone down a lot since I was in Montreal, and I was like, ooh, I can understand everything. Anyway, when he said, that Canada wants to have the most puissant economy, the most powerful economy in the G7, that jumped out at me. I mean, that is damn ambitious. We can get into some of the other, programs and timelines. But what did you think about, first of all, saying to Canadians we're a confident country as opposed to broken, the narrative that Polyev was running, and also saying we can be the most powerful economy in the G7? I mean, does that seem to you like pie in the sky, or is that the kind of ambitious language we need to meet the challenge?
Like everything, I have mixed feelings. I mean, I have just reached a point in my career and my life where my feelings about pretty much everything, except for my home life and my dog, are mixed.
It comes from
And
what's in your when you're in your 40s, David. I think you're in your 40s, right?
yeah,
You
just
hit your
barely,
40s
but
and suddenly you're like, there's nuance, right?
yeah, and trade-offs and challenges and risks and all kinds of things. And I'm watching and thinking Paul Wells had an interesting piece after, when he looked at two things, and that was one of the two, and he said either you mean that and good luck, or you don't mean that and it shouldn't be there. And I'm sort of closer to the you mean it and good luck. So I think that the tone is really important. I think the framing is really, really important. I think the energy is really, really important. In fact, I wish the left, the socialist left, the new democratic left would bring that same kind of energy, or as the kids now say, aura,
Yeah.
to that one's for TikTok, to their politics. I think that's really, really important. And we've seen that in the past. We saw it in the 1960s with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who tried to assert the same sort of thing. We saw that in the 80s with Pierre Elliott Trudeau trying to, when he repatriated the Constitution. We saw that in maybe there's a Trudeau theme here. We saw that in 2015 with Justin Trudeau, and Canada was back. But in every instance, these things run into reality at some point, which is it's great to talk like that. It's important to talk like that. You want to set the bar high. You want to be energetic. You want to be ambitious. But then you've got to do politics. And politics means trade-offs. Politics means nuance. Politics means having to fight with people. Politics means winning sometimes and losing sometimes. It means courts. It means protests. It means consultations. It means getting tied up in the House of Commons at committee. It means getting tied up in the Senate. And all of a sudden, all of these ambitious, big projects you have, these timelines you have, aggressive timelines, then meet the fact that, oh my Lord, we got to deal with the provinces who may not want to fast track internal free trade by Canada today like we want to. You meet G7 countries who are like, you know what, maybe we want to be the biggest economy in the G7, not you, Canada. Go tell the Germans you're going to be a bigger economy and a more ambitious and aggressive economy. So the energy is important, but then you've got to do the politics, and you've got to accept that sometimes you're not going to live up to it. And therein is a risk, by the way, because Carney has set the bar high. He set it very high. And now the expectations are high. And when you don't meet them, you see what happens. Because when Justin Trudeau came in 2015, he was untouchable. He was Teflon coated. And he was for a couple of years. And then by the time he was on his way out, that Teflon had worn off.
You know what? There's a lot in there. And so let me unpack a little bit of it and I'll start from the back. The night that Justin won, I was doing live stuff in the CTV newsroom and I exclaimed something. It might have been an expletive when so they ran over and did a clip. But I think it was when, I saw the East Coast go completely red. And then once that red wave hit Quebec, I was like, I might have said, holy shit or something. I don't know. But just the awareness that this wasn't even going to be close. And this was after hearing for months that Harper had a huge war chest and all the rest of it, right? So that was a big moment. But the difference though with Trudeau, and I would argue maybe even with his father, was they were heavy on the Canadian vibe stuff, right? That's the Trudeau brand. They were great at talking about the greatness of Canada. I don't remember from Trudeau, even in the early days, anything as specific as what Carney's doing. So Carney is literally saying, I intend to make this one super economy, get rid of all these territorial and provincial trade barriers by Canada Day.
Mhm.
And then he throws on top of that, and we're going to have a whole new trade deal with EU by Canada Day. And I'm thinking, what else are we going to have? 500,000 houses by Canada Day? Like this guy is like, so I used to run a chamber of commerce, right? And I love when people put actual timelines to things because then there's accountability and there's tracking. And I tweeted Carney back in the day and I said, like, I don't support candidates from parties. I'm not partisan. I'm going all in to support you to stop Polyev and MAGA. But this housing thing is my main priority because I work with people who are suffering in homelessness, and I very much want those freaking houses built in this housing crisis. So for him to put big numbers, even people like myself who went out of my way to support his campaign, I'm going to hold him to account on
Yeah.
that. So, I mean, there's a risk to saying with such specificity when you're new to the gig that you can get these things done. At the same time, though, and I think this is where I'm more on the good luck scale that you are and Paul is that perhaps this is a moment, as the King said in the throne speech, where Canada is going to, revitalize its economy the most since the Second World War. Carney doesn't have the same approach to politics, right? He's talking about doing having deals with provinces that big projects get one review and it's encompassing, and so they're not wasting time. And he's sort of setting up structures
Mhm.
to fast track decision making, which is, as you know, a corporate skill, right? So I feel as though Trudeau didn't have that kind of skill set. Other politicians didn't have it. Didn't seem like Polyev would have it. Is it possible, do you think, David, that our hopes are, we don't have to be quite so cynical because this is a guy bringing in a whole new set of skills, it seems, and relationship equity that we haven't seen from sort of more domestic Canadian lifetime politicians?
I think there's a couple of things there. One is I don't think we should ever admit defeat in advance.
Mhm.
There's just
I
there's
agree.
there is a kind of
Yes.
shop-worn cynicism amidst the Canadian punditocracy that would, I think, suggest that we just should lay down our arms before a shot is fired. I don't subscribe to that. When I say good luck, I subscribe to more the philosophy of be ambitious, or the approach rather of be ambitious, but be prepared to be flexible, and be prepared to bend to reality as much as you're trying to bend reality, right?
Right.
Because it's great to try to get things done quickly,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean you should steamroll communities. It doesn't mean you should steamroll indigenous nations. It doesn't mean you should try to abrogate rights and steamroll the charter. There's already been some concerns expressed by indigenous nations who say, okay, speeding things up, that's maybe okay, but we're a little bit weary of this idea that you're going to, consult us, but get the job done. Because what if we don't want the job done? And we saw this with Justin Trudeau and pipelines, right? And we saw the protests that emerge. So, for instance, say the government wants to ram through an energy project, an indigenous nation or land defenders say we don't want it, and they go and camp out. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to go send in the cops, as the Trudeau government eventually did? Things sour pretty quickly. So I think the ambition is important, but you have to be attentive to reality. I think the timelines are also the timelines of someone who's spent a lot of time in the corporate world and who's now got to learn politics. So one of my critiques slash praises of Carney, and I try to be very fair about this, is he's a technocrat who doesn't know politics, but who's going to have to learn politics really quickly, and he's shown some capacity to do that. If you look at him in his first couple of days, you can see he's a new politician. A couple of weeks in, he seems like he's getting the hang of it pretty quickly. That's when he's running. But now he's got to govern. So we'll see how he governs. So and here's the thing. I have lots of disagreements, lots of critiques for tons of things I could say critically about him. But I do hope that he's able to succeed at a lot of these things. I do hope that he's able to build 500,000 houses. Of course, the government's not going to be building those houses. I do hope that he's able to lower trade barriers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, I think you're going to have to to accept the fact that once you start doing that, it gets so much harder.
Mhm.
And you're in a minority parliament that probably will last longer than you might expect, but could fall if things get really bad really quickly.
I think also if we're kind of gaming out the potentials here, I'm thinking of the Lincoln quote, right? When you have the will of the people, you can do anything. When you don't, you can accomplish nothing. I'm paraphrasing poorly, but the idea being there that, Carney got the Liberal leadership by what, an 80-point, lead. He came in and he's getting credited, at least in American and UK media that I listen to, with one of the biggest turnarounds in political
For
history in the
sure.
world. It's massive, the swing. They're all talking about the swing. Even if they don't understand the players and don't understand the nuance, they're talking about this massive swing. Of course, all anti-Trump, they're crediting it to. And they're also saying that, first came Canada, then came Australia, then came Romania. It's part of this almost domino effect of protecting democracy over rising autocracy. So Carney has international superstardom right now for the bond market thing, where he,
Mhm.
he kind of winked at 22 minutes when he said, you know what, I can't possibly talk about that, whether he helped with the bond market and reversing Liberation Day crazy tax on penguins nonsense. But he has this international halo, if you will, that no other Canadian prime minister has ever had, even in the height of the Trudeau popularity. Or Mulroney was doing good things internationally and had good rapport with the US president, but nobody's quite coming into the job with the kind of international superstardom that Carney has. And he's got Canadians right now. And if he gets a couple of big wins on the board, David, like getting this united Canadian economy by Canada Day, and with the level of comms production that they have, like high level communications coming out of that office for the first time that I've seen from a Canadian party, honestly, I'm very impressed. It's slick.
Mhm.
And so with slick comms and with one big achievement on the board, he might be able to keep the people with him. And there's tremendous amount that can be done when you have that kind of political equity to spend right off the top. So I'm cautiously optimistic, I think, to say with Carney. But I also think he's a high performer, and he will react to criticism of his achievements with more achievement, as opposed to, I think, getting incalcitrant and getting dug down and getting defensive. Your thoughts on that? If things don't meet the targets and we get on them?
Yeah, so the Canadian electorate, I'm trying to think of the most charitable word here.
Too dumb for democracy? No.
Fickle, yeah, well, for sure, although there's always the hope springs eternal, but fickle.
Pickle's
I
good.
mean, the perfect example is go back to January 6th, when Justin Trudeau says, I'm out by March, and the Conservatives are up 20, 25 points and then end up losing the election. You can lose it really quickly. And it's funny because if you go back and look at the actual returns, and I think Dan Arnold did this work, the Liberals were something like fewer than 100 votes away from a majority government, something like that, or maybe it was 600. Anyway, they were a very small percentage of the vote away from a majority government if you distributed that vote in the ridings that were actually quite close, which were down to double-digit leads. So the Liberals almost won a majority government after being down 25 points, and the Tories were headed for 200 points. So that gives you a sense of how quickly things can change, but also how extraordinary Carney's comeback was. And I think you can't pull that off without Donald Trump, but you probably also can't pull that off without Mark Carney for the reasons that you listed. He comes to the job with a CV that's more extraordinary than any prime minister, probably since Lester B. Pearson, and perhaps ever. So that's point one. Point two, though, is if you look at the polls now, the Tories are now creeping back towards the lead because people are already like, well, because we're so fickle and unforgiving. But I think you're right. If we put up some wins, if things start to get better, then I think there's going to be a lot of goodwill there, with the big caveat that no human being can control Donald Trump. And no human being can control the effects of Donald Trump, even if you can moderate them a little bit. If the world heads into a global recession because the United States has decided to tear down the global trade order, then that's going to be extraordinarily difficult. And people are still coping with the trauma of the pandemic. We're still, in many ways, living in the pandemic, both literally and figuratively. We're still dealing with the affordability crisis, the housing crisis, the climate crisis,
Yeah.
wars around the world, a reordering of the global order, which we don't know where it's going to go. And these things are extremely anxiety inducing. And I think a lot of the appeal of Mark Carney, which I misunderstood at first,
Oh, yeah.
was that people actually wanted a kind of stolid technocrat, avuncular figure who would come in and say, I'm on this. But then it's got to translate to being on it. And the other bit I'll add is we also have to look at the people around Mark Carney, some of whom, the cabinet I'm speaking of, some of whom are quite talented and some of whom are not. So I look around and say, someone like Dominic LeBlanc, I've got a lot of faith in his capacity. Chrystia Freeland, in her capacity in her limited files, where she's going to be, I think, below the radar, has a lot of capacity to manage those files quite well. But then I look at Gregor Robertson and I'm not so sure. I look at Stephen Guilbeault and I'm almost certainly sure he's not the right spot. And so Melanie Joly is a wild card. I'm not convinced. So then I look around and say, well, Carney can only do so much because he is a high performer, but he's also a micromanager,
Absolutely.
which is really dangerous in this job. And he's got a cabinet that is prone to what we once called bozo interruptions
Mm.
in some cases. So that becomes a bit of a liability too. So it's all to say that we're going to see what happens when the politics happens. And then, of course, he's got to manage the House. And being in the House is going to be tough. So there's a lot of capacity there, a lot of risk.
Mhm.
It's actually kind of one of the more interesting and exciting times in Canadian politics in a long time because the stakes feel like they're actually quite high, but also the capacity to deliver big changes seems, for the better or worse, because some of those changes might not be great, um, quite significant too.
Well, a couple of points, and then I want to shift to the U.S. ambassador since you mentioned Trump.
Yeah.
Uh, and just in terms of fast tracking through, working with Indigenous people and treaties and all of those complexities, I'm going to have Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario, on for a second show this week on Friday because Bill 5 requires conversation before 4 jams it through.
Yeah.
And already there's been pushback by Indigenous groups on that, and maybe they're going to get forward to try to make it a little less by fiat and a little bit more about democracy. So that'll be coming up with Kathleen Wynne. When it comes to will the other G7 nations step aside for Carney's ambition, we are in a global trade war, and arguably the top celebrity economist is running Canada. And I think that there's a certain amount of appreciation from other G7 leaders that Carney is at the table. So I think that he walks into this moment with an opportunity to have Canada lead that nothing else would have really let, even if we become a petrol, a superpower with gas and natural energy and traditional energy sources. And Carney brings us to that kind of vision of the best economy in the G7. I think there might be more leeway for him, given the fact that people are counting on his ability to stand up to Trump. That being said, Trump is a mercurial madman. We all know that, and we've had more than enough time to observe that. And when the US ambassador, the former ambassador, the Biden guy, said that Canada was overreacting, Charles and I dropped a couple F-bombs on the last show, which people should check out. But also, we heard, the new ambassador just not even 5 days ago or something say, oh, we're over this Annex Canada thing. Canadians should get over it. We're hurting too, stop whining. And then boom, as soon as Charles shows up, we've got Trump talking about this Golden Dome nonsense and about, Canada could get a deal if we were the cherished 51st state. So where are you on the state of U.S. ambassadors to Canada, the
Oh,
Golden Dome, the 51st state, wherever you'd like to go, David?
I'm so pissed off by all of this. I'm trying to measure my words a little
You don't
bit
have to.
here.
It's the O Show.
Yeah, but even still, I mean, it's one of those things where the analogy I use is this, because I get asked by international media and domestic media, but particularly by international media, are you taking these threats seriously? And I always say, you get up, you get in your car, and you put your seatbelt on, right? Unless you're an idiot. And you put your seatbelt on not because you think I'm going to get in an accident today, but because you think if I do get in an accident, I really want my seatbelt on, which is to say I want to be prepared for the worst. And that's how I think about the 51st state thing. It's like, I don't, you know, are tanks going to roll across the border? I don't think so. But by God, I kind of want to be prepared in case they do. And that's the extraordinary circumstance. Or if we're going to go to economic war, which we obviously are, I want to be prepared with a better internal economy, and I want to be prepared with a new defense relationships with Europe, which is something Mark Carney is pursuing, I think to his credit. I want to be prepared with better trade deals with other countries too, although we still are stuck trading with the US to some extent because it's so damn close and it's easy. But go build out Mercosur and in Latin America, South America, go build out Asia, Japan, Korea, go build out the ASEAN countries. That's great. So that's the 51st state prep stuff. On the ambassador, I'm really torn here between the diplomacy is important. We have to do realpolitik and politics, and we have to work with this bozo and kick his ass out. He's offensive. He's obnoxious. I don't like him. I don't like his face. I don't like what he says. Send him packing to wherever the hell he came from, one-way ticket with a swift metaphorical kick in the ass. And so I'm torn between these two things. And I think the smarter move actually right now is the former. They just got here, work with him. He's a conduit. He's been confirmed. That's a whole thing. Sending him home was actually probably not a good idea.
Although
But
that is what you advocated for on X.
yeah, because I was pissed. And I was like, kick him right back home where he came from, which is, I don't know what state he's from. I don't know. But I think the actual, in the kind of calm, still waters of reflection, you say, well, okay, we got to work with this guy. But I actually think if he keeps yapping,
Mhm,
summon him,
mhm,
summon him,
mhm.
and say to him, knock it off. Because at some point, you've got to do this. And Mark Carney's walking a fine line, which I'm willing to walk with him for a bit. And that's we got to be tough on Trump. Trump's a threat. He wants to break us so he can own us. I'm going to stand up, elbows up. This was the kind of campaign rhetoric. But then turning around and saying, well, we might join the Golden Dome. Uh, Trump is a transformational president. I thought Carney walked the line fairly fine in the Oval Office because you don't go in there shooting your mouth off and win. That's how you lose. But at some point, you can't have it both ways anymore. You actually have to say, okay, enough's enough. Because Carney said, we're this 51st state stuff, we're going to put an end to it. But then obviously that hasn't happened. So at some point, I think he's going to have to call the ambassador to the carpet and have a little chit chat and say, knock it off.
Yeah.
And if that persists, maybe then you send him home.
I feel
But
like Carney doesn't suffer fools well. Uh,
no,
so
obviously
I, I
not.
I think he's going to jettison his cabinet as soon as they don't deliver. If we're going with our whole concept of him as being a perfectionist, I think. And I mean, I love his sense of humor. It's rare to find someone who's so super A and so perfectionistic and micromanaging and results driven and also be funny and relaxed, which I think is why Canadians are feeling like, wow, this guy is something. Even if you don't like his policies and like his intellect and like his diplomacy, you're looking at his media going, wow, this guy can have a good time laughing on the most important speech of his life with the freaking king there. He's howling as he's dragging the speaker, right? So I think that Carney will haul the ambassador in the second he feels like it. I'm
Mhm.
not concerned about that. And I think from a perspective on the Golden Dome, Carney's answer was, I don't negotiate publicly, which is
Smart.
itself setting down a hell of a framework for Trump, because Trump delights in the public negotiation in the Oval Office. He delights in the Twitter exchange and firing everybody up and forcing people to issue statements. So Carney said brilliantly to the BBC right after you got elected, and they said, when are you going to go to the Oval? He said, well, I'm not a tourist. I've been there. I've seen the thing, and I've been to Florida. I'll go when there's a serious agenda. And Anthony Scaramucci, who knows Trump well, said, and knew Carney for 20 years, said that Carney was co-producing the visit. He was not letting himself be one of the actors in Trump's daily reality show. He was co-producing the episode. We even saw videos come out from both camps afterwards. So I think, David, what allays my concerns a little bit around Trump is that I feel like Carney's working him on a level we can't always see, but so far it's been pretty successful. He even said that he thinks the tariff thing might end by the end of the year. In his interview with CBC, he's saying, he thinks that there'll be an end to these tariffs. And so, I mean, it's sounding as though Carney is playing on several different levels. And so I'm willing to, let's see how he manages this madman that nobody else seems to know how to get a handle on. All I know is other leaders around the world, including Bono, who I have been, a massive U2 fan since 1980 something, Bono said that, Canada showed the world that you can elect competence over populism, and he said the whole world is grateful to Canada and watching Canada. And that was an amazing thing to hear come from Bono. And kudos to Jeff MacArthur, who did the follow-up about Bono saying the world needs more Canada back in 2016, I think it was. Um, but I mean, this idea that you've got someone like Bono saying, the whole world is watching Canada and taking a lead from us in terms of elbows up. So I just want to end on this. We're coming into, you're writing a book when you said when you get enough time on Canadian nationalism, its history, its sources, where it's going. We're heading into a hyper nationalistic phase with Canada Day and all these targets. And we've also got this Alberta separation threat, which is kind of being dangled. So just last thoughts, David, on both the Alberta situation and on just some top notes on our nationalist thing. I don't want to ask for your whole book,
Well, good. 'Cause it's not ready yet, so I would show up semi-empty-handed, trying to get it out quickly because there's a real moment, which means that my summer of grilling in the backyard with the dog has been canceled. I too am on an ambitious timeline to deliver by Canada Day, give or take. But I think nationalism is tricky, and it when as an emotion, which is fundamentally an emotional commitment to the state or to a group of people. It can be civic at the kind of level of the state, but it could also be ethnic at the level of a people. It can be extraordinarily useful. It can be extraordinarily dangerous. You don't maybe get the social programs and healthcare we have in Canada without a little bit of commitment to nationalism. You also probably don't get Yugoslavia in the 1990s without nationalism, to give you a sense of the spectrum. So promise, peril. So that's the first thing I'm looking at is, okay, what do we do with this? What can we make of it that can be useful and good for building institutions? What do we have to watch for so that it doesn't become exclusive and destructive and bigoted? Because there's a lot of energy out there for those causes, anti-causes, and I'm deeply worried about that. The separatist question plays into this because Albertan separatism isn't about a people. It's not an ethnic-based separatist movement like it is in Quebec, or a linguistic-based separatist movement like it is in Quebec. It's fundamentally a kind of grievance-based sentiment that expresses, I think, a partisanship. And if you look at data from some folks, you can go and look this up. Philip Fournier talks about this. Uh, if the Liberals hadn't won, support for Albertan separatism would be much lower than it is because they won. So we have a kind of partisan divide that's being stoked by partisans in Alberta, by UCP partisans for political gain. And they're playing with a very, very, very dangerous force in the way that David Cameron in the United Kingdom was ahead of Brexit. And we saw what happened there. So that makes me nervous in and of itself because it threatens to tear Canada apart, threatens to harm the country as a whole, but also Alberta. It also threatens to reignite Quebec nationalism and separatism, which could truly just tear the country apart, limb from limb, and that would be the end of Canada. And that's all kind of simmering as we face everything else. And that's going to be very, very hard to navigate. So that makes me nervous. I see a lot of hope. I see a lot of risk. And I'm hoping that one of Mark Carney's skills will be navigating the Federation in the way, incidentally, that Stephen Harper did. Because whenever I'm asked to say something nice about Stephen Harper, I say, I actually think he managed federalism quite well. And the best way to manage federalism is the quietest way to manage federalism. Find a way to manage it very, very quietly, very, very carefully, away from the spotlight, one-on-one if you can, and just get the country through the day. Because as others have said, Canada is a very, very hard country to govern. And I think a lot of people are counting on Mark Carney's expertise and capacity to figure out how to navigate without running aground, because it's an ever-present risk, but particularly present right now.
Yeah, and you didn't go quite as far as I go in terms of some of what's ginning up, to use an Obama expression, ginning up what's going on with Alberta separatism. I think MAGA is involved. I mean, if they can't take the country whole cloth, they're going to try to make us weaker by trying to pull off Alberta, which makes total sense. And I did an op-ed recently, having grown up in Quebec and being there in the first of the referendums, saying how different the Quebec referendums were in terms of what motivated them and everything else and what's animating them. So I don't see the same animation in Quebec right now, especially given the votes that went towards Carney. I think that there's a sense of let's have some competency and some economic success and some fairness in this country, but not quite where we're rattling our swords, right? So to me, I love that distinction you made about the different kinds of nationalism, and I can't wait for your book. And I think that for Canadians to look at the motivations between Albertans, it doesn't mean some Albertans aren't grievanced and aren't partisan and aren't frustrated. All that can be true, but from all the OShow viewers that we have from Alberta, which is significant, they don't want to separate. They don't like this language. They think the UPC government and Danielle Smith is in fact mired in the corrupt care scandal, and this is all just noise and cover. I'm worried about the full extent of Bannon and Trump's manifest destiny spheres of influence theory and how real it is that they want to get Canada any way they can. So we'll have to stay and watch that. David, I expected you to be brilliant because you're very snarky and quick on Twitter, and that's usually a good sign of intelligence. But I've really enjoyed this conversation. Love to have you back when you're closer to your book and we can kind of track whether or not Carney is meeting our high expectations which he set. So thank you so much for being on the OShow. I know people can find you on Substack. They can subscribe. They can look for your previous book, which is Too Dumb for Democracy, and the coming book, which is, do you have a title?
On Nationalism.
On Nationalism. Are you going to add like Canada, A Canada or fucking A or something?
Probably have to. Not elbows out, but something like that, I'm sure.
Well, Charles Sangus and I ended the last OShow with fucking A because we are all on Team Save Canada, even if we come from different backgrounds. Thank you so much, David Moscrop. And please, OShow viewers, keep sharing. Let's get to 5,000 subs. The clips are getting hundreds of thousands of views. We love all the support because we're building a pro-democracy conversation in Canada, which is incredibly important in these fraught times. Thank you, David Moscrop. And as I said, coming up Friday, we've got Kathleen Wynne. She's back and she's got a lot to say about what's happening in Ontario. Maybe I'll talk to her a bit about Canada as well. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the OShow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the OShow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the OShow. It's the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. And with a lot of great gas, she puts them to the test on the OShow. Yeah, there's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the OShow. You gotta stand for something or fall for it all. Canada, you hear the call of the OShow. It's a podcast, the OShow. Laura Babcock's the OShow. Stay informed with the OShow, OShow. Your merch bid.